Vintage port is one of the most collectible, sought-after wines in the world. Hailing from the Douro in Portugal, it gets its name after a port city at the end of the Douro River. Port in general is ruby or red ports, and then tawny ports. Ruby or red ports are what vintage ports fall into. You have a hierarchy at the bottom end. You have ports that are just labeled as ruby. They're a little bit cheaper. You see ruby reserve all the way up to LBV, late bottle vintage, then up to crusted, single quinta, and then vintage port like we have here today. Tawny ports, on the other hand, are a little bit golden, more nutty in color, and almost a different style of wine completely. I won't talk about tawny port. I talked about that in a separate video. I know port can be confusing as a category because there are so many types. I know for myself it was so confusing until I started going to Portugal, going to the Douro. That's when you start to absorb all the information, you start to understand everything. There is no substitute for travel when it comes to learning about wine. Port is broken down into the quintas, the farmers, those are the people supplying grapes, and then the shippers. The big brands that you know, like Wares, Taylor's, Croft, like we have here today, are the shippers. What happens is all the quintas, all the farmers supply the grapes. These port houses, these shippers are brands. They're the ones that blend and put the wine together. Most of port wines are non-vintage wines. They're blends of old vintages and new vintages. Vintage ports are obviously special because they come from a single harvest. A couple years after the harvest date, after the shippers and producers send samples to the governing body, they determine if the wines in the year was good enough to declare a vintage port. It doesn't happen every single year. I have one of the relatively new declared vintages, 2017. Also have 2007, 2003, excellent port vintage years. And then a single Quinta port from 1995 from Croft because I want to see the development. Although vintage ports are generally the most expensive when it comes to all the wines from the region, these here, I think brand new on release, you're going to expect to spend at least $90 to $110 on a vintage port. Producers will tell you, even though they're the most expensive, they can be the most complex. They're actually relatively easy port wines to make. And the reason is a lot of ports are blends from different vintages, different sites. Vintage port come from a few special sites. They're then aged in the barrel for 2 years. Then they're put in the bottle and then sold. You're the one that's supposed to cellar them. The other wines of the region are made and blended. They're intended to be ready to drink right when you buy them. Vintage port are made from grapes like Touriga Nacional, Touriga Franca, Tinta Roriz, which is also known as Tempranillo, and then a slew of other grapes. What happens is the fermentation starts, and once it gets to a certain point, grape brandy is added. That stops the fermentation, that leaves the sugar in the must. The alcohol rises, obviously, because you're adding high alcohol. So ports come in around 20% in alcohol. They're pretty rich. They have a lot of sugar. They are delicious though because it has juicy acidity and tannins. My criticism when it comes to port is I usually prefer to drink vintage port, younger ports. I know I get a lot of enjoyment out of them. When I'm in the Douro often and I'm drinking some older ports and producers are blinding me to them, I sometimes have no idea what year they are. As a wine professional, I get the chance to do a lot of verticals like this. I wish that more people would have the chance to experience that, so I'm just going to try to recreate the experience for you here today. All right, tasting out of this nice, simple Schwarzweißel glass. I like this glass because it's small, it's durable, and if you're just tasting, since it's smaller, there's more wine to glass ratio instead of tasting out of a bigger glass like I normally do when it comes to wine enjoyment. I'll put a link in the description box if you want to check it out. Okay, I Coravin these beforehand into plastic cups because I didn't want to tip them too much because there might be sediment in some. Let's get tasting. Let's start with the young one, 2017. Croft is a shipper with a long history, goes back to the 17th century, although I think the first vintage, the first bottle labeled as Croft didn't appear until the late 1700s. It now belongs to the Fladgate group with brands like Taylor and Fonseca. Let's start out with wine number 1 here, 2017. Black raspberries, chocolate, leather. You know, these wines are really collectible, and although you know that they're going to be a little sweeter, they do have some resemblance to Bordeaux. That's why they were popular in England. In fact, when there was a little bit of tension between that part of France, Bordeaux, and Britain, the Brits went other places, like the Douro in Portugal, to try to find other wines to drink. Oh. Raspberry, chocolate, leather, even a bit crushed flour. This just smells really pretty. And I want to drink it. It took me a long time to really start to get into ports because I'm not a spirits drinker. I don't like the high alcohol, but the sugar here and the flavors are carried by the high alcohol. This is delicious. And port, even though it's high in sugar, high in alcohol, has so much acidity that it keeps the palate relatively fresh. That's pretty good. Like, oh, man, that's pretty good. That to me is like a 94 point wine. Let's move on to the 2007. So we got 10 years here. We'll move on to 2, which is 2007. 10 years of development here. Man, I don't think I'll be able to spit all these wines. I think I'm going to drink some of them. Okay, now this is not as fruity as the other one. I'm too young in the industry to remember when the spirits that they used to fortify port wines were not as good, and then they weren't as good with tannin extraction, so young ports were just not enjoyable to drink. In the mid-90s, that was like the new revolution of port. The wines were made to be a little bit fresher, easier to drink, younger. The spirits quality was better, and obviously the winemaking improved drastically. So this is definitely not as expressive as the 2017 port. Aged wines sometimes can go through a dumb phase, a phase where they're not as expressive. Okay, but it comes out here. It's so fun. It tastes very similar to 2017. It just doesn't have as much fruit flavors. I get a little more bottle patina. You get some tobacco. You still get the leather, but just not as much bright fruit. The palate is a different, man. Port has great acidity. That's so lovely to drink. Everything kind of comes together on the palate, although it's not as rich, not as fruity, not as concentrated. You know, that's what's lovely about drinking young vintage port sometimes. I think if you have this 2007, it might be going through a dumb phase. Maybe you wait a little while. We have the 2003 next. It's super good to me, 92 plus, but compared to something that the other one. Among port wines, I think 2017 was the most declared vintage, and what I mean by that, houses or shippers said this. They want their wine to be a vintage port, so it is declared. I think 2003, 2007 might have been tied for like the second most declared vintage. Let's go to 3 here. Now 3 shows some development. You're gonna get some tomato leaf, a little bit of tobacco. I know it doesn't sound good, but when you have aged red wines, you kind of have this mud flavor, so to speak. And what's funny about vintage port wines, because the alcohol and the sugar keep them stable, you don't get a lot of volatile acidity, VA. What happens to all wines is they eventually want to become vinegar. That's why you get some of that VA, those vinegary flavors. However, sugar, tannins, and alcohol are what help preserve wines, and port has plenty of it. Tobacco, red cherry, a little bit of tomato leaf, pepper, a little bit of flowers. This is incredibly complex. This really sings on the palate. Really sings. It's not as rich and concentrated as the 2017. There's not as much fruit, so you're going to feel the alcohol a little bit more in the vintage port as the fruit falls off. There is going to be sediment down there. I corvin these because a couple of these I am going to open, retaste, and share, especially this 2003. I have a collector dinner tonight. I am going to decant it, leave some of the sediment there. You're going to feel a little bit more of the alcohol. But besides that, this is balanced, well put together. This is in a place right now where I'm really enjoying drinking it. You know, if I gave the 1794, I'd probably give this 94 plus, maybe even 95. I think it's pretty darn exceptional. Oh, that's so good. That's really good wine. Let's move on to the... So far I prefer this the most than the youngest. Let's move on to the next one. This is the Croft Quinta de Roeda 1995 Vintage Porto. I don't believe that 95 was widely declared as a vintage. What you have there is single Quinta ports, and what happens with that is it's not widely declared as a vintage port, but they source grapes from this Quinta. This is owned by Croft. They thought it was still a good year for their property, so they call it a single Quinta port. You're not going to find a bunch of vintage ports, but you'll have different producers, if they had a good year, declare a single Quinta vintage port. That's what we have here. I don't know, I just want to taste it. I actually got sent these by a guy named Steve from Co-Brand when I was at the Wine Spectator New York Experience event. he just tracked me down. He's like, hey, pass me his card. He's like, if you ever want any port samples, let me help you out. It's cool as this platform grows. I get excited about samples, things like vintage port, champagne, Burgundy, which I'm getting here today. I'm pretty pumped about it. I feel like I made it. I made it. By the way, the Douro is probably the most spectacular region in the world for me. It's the UNESCO World Heritage Site. Super steep vineyards as far as you can see. Yes, I love the Mosel, the R2. I love places in Italy, places in France, but the Douro is just so big and vast. It's a special place, man. Let's move to 95 here. 95 has some menthol type notes, something that I associate a little bit more with Australian wine. These two, 2003, 95 here, this is where you're starting to move into the dried fruit flavors. Dried sour plum, dried cherry. You still get the leatheriness. I feel though like sometimes in younger ports, I get more leather flavors. I get a little bit of that mud flavor. Again, super balanced. And this 95, it's like nothing sticks out. It's just balanced all the way. Oh, it's good. I feel like I might want a little bit more fruit, so I think 2003 is a good drinking place. I like this. I mean, my favorites were probably 2003, the 17, and then 95. 95, I'd probably give 93 points. But definitely has more mature flavors. So if there are people out there, if you like older wine, you do want to hold on to the ports a little bit longer. For me, man, I like the young ones, but also I love when you hit a sweet spot like the 2003. That's super good. I think the main message, though, is we buy vintage ports, other collectible wines to be put in the cellar to drink on special occasions. But wine is meant to be drank. So if you have that special bottle, maybe you don't have a reason, just open it. Wine is meant to be open, meant to be enjoyed, meant to be shared with friends and family. So yeah, that's how like tasting like that goes. Tell me, do you like port? Do you like vintage port? Have you tasted Croft, or do you have any other favorite shippers? I'd love to hear. I'm excited to share this bottle a little bit later. Drop it in the comments below.